In 79 CE, on a street corner in Pompeii, you could read a menu scratched into plaster, not for food, for bodies, with prices, with reviews, with acts so explicit that modern translators still hesitate to publish them. Mount Vesuvius preserved every word. Tonight, we're reading them all. This isn't a lesson in ancient depravity, it's a mirror, and by the end, you'll recognize your own reflection staring back. The Romans kept meticulous records not from shame, not from pride, but from normalcy. They wrote it all down because it was just business, and that's the most disturbing part. What follows is a journey through their words, their prices, their brutal honesty. By the time we reach the end, you'll understand why one soldier's confession outlasted an empire and why we're still writing the same story, just with better PR. If you're ready to look in the mirror, hit subscribe. If this makes you uncomfortable, good. That means you're paying attention. Like, share, and comment your location below. Let's map how far this honesty reaches. In the year 79 CE, in the Roman city of Pompeii, you could buy sex for 2 asses, 2 small brass coins. That was the same price as a loaf of bread. Think about that for a moment. A human body, an intimate act, worth exactly the same as your lunch. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't whispered about in secret. The price was written right on the wall. Clear, simple, honest. This happened at a place called the Lupana Grande. In Latin, that means the Great Wolf Den. It was the most famous brothel in Pompeii, maybe in the entire Roman Empire. The building still stands today. 2 stories, stone walls, small rooms, and those walls are covered in writing. Over 120 inscriptions, scratched into the plaster by the men who visited. Names, dates, reviews, prices, services. When Mount Vesuvius erupted on August 24th in the year 79 CE, it buried Pompeii under volcanic ash. The city was frozen in time, and so were those words on the walls. Archaeologists found them in 1862. They were shocked. These weren't the polished words of poets or politicians. This was raw, real, unfiltered. The men who scratched these words into the walls thought no one important would ever read them. They were wrong. Those words survived for almost 2,000 years. So here's the question we need to answer. What does it mean when a civilization treats intimacy like a commodity? When sex costs the same as bread? When human bodies are bought and sold as casually as food in a market? We're not here to judge the Romans. We're here to understand them, to look at the evidence they left behind, to read the words they wrote when they thought no one was watching. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The Romans were honest about what they were doing. They didn't hide it. They didn't use fancy words to make it sound better. They just wrote the price on the wall. By the end of this story, you'll understand why these walls tell us more about humanity than any history book ever could. Not because the Romans were different from us, but because they weren't. It's a summer evening in Pompeii. The year is 79 CE. The afternoon heat is finally breaking. The city is waking up for the night. You're a merchant. You've come to Pompeii on business. Your cargo of olive oil from Spain is safely stored near the port. Your meetings went well. Now you have an evening to yourself. You're not interested in going back to your rented room alone. You don't need to ask anyone where to go. Everyone knows. You just follow the flow of people moving through the narrow streets, away from the main forum, into the neighborhoods where the wine shops cluster together. The streets get narrower. Your sandals click on volcanic stone. It's been worn smooth by decades of cartwheels and footsteps. Then you see it. From the outside, it looks unremarkable. Just another building. There's no sign, no advertisement. Everyone already knows what it is. A narrow entrance on Vico del Lupanar. Stone walls, 2 stories. This is the Lupana Grande, the Great Wolf Den, the only purpose-built brothel in the entire city. You step inside, the smell hits you first. Olive oil lamps have been burning for hours. The smoke is thick and rancid. It coats the upper walls in black soot. You can smell unwashed bodies, cheap wine that's been cut with seawater to make it last longer. And underneath everything else, there's the sharp smell from the latrine. It's located right under the wooden staircase to your left. Someone tried to cover the smell. You catch hints of rose oil, something floral and sweet, but it's turned sour in the heat. It doesn't really work. You're not here for the smell. The corridor is narrow, maybe 8 feet across. It's dim inside. The only light comes from small clay oil lamps sitting in wall niches. The flames flicker. Shadows move and dance across the walls. You hear voices, a man negotiating a price, low moans from behind a curtain, footsteps on stone, the creak of a wooden bed frame, and then you notice the walls. Every surface is covered in writing, hundreds of scratches in the plaster, some done with a metal stylus, some with a knife, some just carved with a fingernail. Names, dates, crude drawings, stick figures, but mostly words, statements, records, reviews. Men who stood right where you're standing now decided to leave their mark, to prove they were here, to say what they did. The plaster is layered with their voices. Some marks are fresh, some are years old. They overlap. They crowd each other. They fight for space. This is the evidence. This is what survived. But before we read what's written there, you need to understand who wrote it, and why. The most common inscription found in the Lupena is just two Latin words, hic futui, here, I fucked. Simple, direct, repeated dozens of times across different walls, different hands, different days. It's the Roman equivalent of a signature, a way of saying, I was here, I did this, I am a man. But some inscriptions are more specific. Heroes hic futuit, cum Philetaerus et Caphisis. Heroes lay here with Philetaerus and Caphisis. 3 names. Were they friends? Business partners? Did they come to the brothel together? Did they make a party of it? Take turns? Share? The inscription doesn't explain. It just records the fact. They were here, together. Other inscriptions work like reviews. Sabina fellas, Nan Bell. Sabina doesn't perform oral sex well. Euplia bene fellas. Euplia performs oral sex well. These aren't hidden complaints whispered in private. They're scratched into the wall for everyone to see. A public rating system, a consumer guide. Think about that. 2,000 years before online reviews, before star ratings, before Yelp or Google, Roman men were doing the exact same thing, rating their experience, warning others, recommending favorites. So why did they feel so free to write these things? Because of a Roman legal concept called infamia meant you had lost your social reputation. You couldn't hold public office. You couldn't testify in court. You couldn't marry into respectable families. Prostitutes carried infamia automatically. So did actors, gladiators, anyone who sold their body for money. The men who visited, they kept their status, as long as they were the ones paying, as long as they were in control, as long as they were the active partner. Roman society had clear rules. Respectable men could visit brothels. They could write on the walls. They could brag about it, but they couldn't write about visiting respectable women. They couldn't name a senator's wife. They couldn't mention a citizen's daughter. The women in the brothel were outside the social order. That's what made them safe to discuss, safe to rate, safe to review. The graffiti served 3 purposes. First, proof of manhood. A man could point to his inscription and say, I did this, I was here. Second, social bonding. Friends came together. They left their names together. It was shared experience, shared proof. Third, consumer information. Which women were worth the higher price? Which services were available? What should you expect? The walls were covered with this information, layer after layer, year after year. But the walls didn't just record who was here. They advertised what you could buy. And the Romans had very specific words for very specific acts. Above each doorway in the Lupena, there's a painting, a fresco. These aren't artistic masterpieces. They're functional, direct. They show different sexual positions. Woman on top, rear entry, side by side, man standing, woman kneeling. Tour guides today call them the menu, as if Roman men were illiterate and needed pictures to understand what sex was. That's not what they were for. They were advertising. They told you this wasn't some Baccali transaction. This establishment offered options, variety, different services at different prices, and the Romans had very specific Latin words for each act, the baseline, the standard. The most common transaction was called futuere, just straightforward intercourse. The verb, futuo, means to penetrate, to take. The man is active. The woman is passive. This is what most men came for. This is what most inscriptions reference. Hic futi, here I fucked. Simple, clear, expected. But Roman sexual language wasn't really about the physical act. It was about power, about who was in control, about who was dominant and who was submissive. That's why the word for rear entry was pedicatio. For Romans, this wasn't about preference. It wasn't about what felt good. It was about asserting power. The active partner maintained his status as a man. The passive partner, whether male or female, accepted the submissive role. You could request this at the Lupena. The woman would comply. The price was usually the same, though some women charged extra. Here's what's important to understand. For Romans, the gender of your partner didn't matter as much as your role. Were you active or passive? Were you penetrating or being penetrated? Were you in control or being controlled? As long as a Roman man was the active partner, his masculinity was intact, his status was secure. Then there was a rumatio. This was the act of ultimate dominance. The buyer seized total control over the seller's capacity to speak, to breathe, to have any agency at all. The inscriptions are clear about this. Mertus fellator, Mertus the fellator. That label carried weight. It meant complete control over another person's body, reducing them to an instrument, to a tool for pleasure. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't shameful for the man paying. The inscriptions prove it was common, normalized, expected. But there was one act the Romans found truly degrading. For a Roman man to perform oral sex on a woman was considered the ultimate humiliation, worse than being penetrated yourself, worse than any passive role. It meant you had os impurum, an impure mouth, a corrupted mouth. Men who did this were socially destroyed. They couldn't speak in public forums. They couldn't be taken seriously. Their reputation was ruined. The graffiti proves this. Froto plain linget cunum. Froto openly licks cunt. This wasn't a boast. It was an attack, a way to shame someone, to destroy their name. Another inscription reads, Secundus, cunnilingus, Secundus, the cuntlicker. These were weapons, ways to humiliate rivals, to spread rumors, to ruin reputations. But here's the paradox. Some inscriptions list it as a service, with a price. Meritimus linget, vulvum, pro quatuor ossibus. Meritimus licks vulva for 4 asses. 4 asses, twice the price of basic intercourse. So someone was paying for it, and someone was willing to do it. Maybe they were men who had nothing left to lose, men who were already marked with infamy, men who'd discovered there was a market for forbidden services. Maybe they catered to women, maybe to men who wanted mutual pleasure instead of just dominance. The historical record doesn't explain, it just preserves the fact. In the economy of Roman sex, even the forbidden act had a price. These weren't just words scratched into walls. They were a price menu, a list of services, a guide to what your money could buy. 2 asses bought you futuaire, the basic transaction. 4 asses bought you something forbidden. 16 asses, a full day's wage for a soldier, bought you time, privacy, a better room, a younger woman. Let me show you what that money bought. The Roman sex trade ran on a simple pricing system. 3 tiers, each offering something different. At the bottom, 2 asses. That bought you a ground floor cell in the Lupena, a stone bed built into the wall waist high, just wide enough for one person if they curled up. No mattress, no cushion, just cold stone. 5 minutes, maybe less if there was a line. The woman working that cell might service 20 men in a day, 30 during festivals. Her body moved through mechanical motions, her mind somewhere else entirely. 2 asses, the price of bread, the price of the cheapest transaction. At the middle tier, 16 asses, a full denarius, a day's wage for a Roman soldier. That bought you the upper floor, larger rooms, wooden doors instead of curtains, an actual bed frame with a wool-stuffed mattress, a small table, wine, a bronze mirror on the wall, and time, maybe half an hour, maybe more if business was slow. The women upstairs were younger, cleaner, often foreign, Greek, Syrian, Egyptian. Exotic was worth paying extra for. You got the illusion of choice, of desire, the fantasy that she wanted you, not just your money. 16 asses bought the pretense of intimacy. At the top tier, 400 sesterti or more. That's more than 400 asses, nearly a third of a soldier's annual disposable income, spent in a single night. You didn't go to the Lupena for that. You went to a private villa, a place like the House of the Centenary, where a separate wing had been converted into an entertainment suite. Real frescoes by real artists, dining couches, garden access, multiple women, music, premium wine, a banquet. These weren't slaves chained to stone beds. They were called meritresses, courtesans. Some were freedwomen who managed their own bookings. They could set their own rates, turn down clients, keep most of what they earned. 400 sesterti bought the fantasy of being loved. But here's what you didn't see, the machinery behind it all. In the year 40 CE, Emperor Caligula formalized a tax on prostitution, the vectigal ex capturis, the tax on takings. It was calculated based on one transaction per day, per worker. The brothel owner paid the state a fixed amount for each woman he owned. And who collected this tax? The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite soldiers, the best trained warriors in the Roman Empire, moonlighting as tax collectors for brothels. The irony would be funny if it weren't so perfectly Roman. The tax revenue went straight to the imperial treasury. It was built into the budget, expected, depended upon. But where did the women come from? Slave markets at the edges of the empire. Thrace, Syria, Gaul. War created supply. When Rome conquered a territory, prisoners became slaves. Women and girls were sorted. The young ones, the attractive ones, they were valuable. Debt created supply. Families who couldn't pay what they owed sometimes sold their daughters. Desperation created supply. Abandoned children, orphans, girls with no family protection. They were transported to cities like Rome and Pompeii, sold at auction, bought by men with money to invest. The brothel manager, called a leno, was often a freedman, a former slave himself. He ran the daily operation for a wealthier man who didn't want his name attached to the business. The leno's job was simple: keep traffic moving, collect money, make sure no one damaged the merchandise too badly. The complete cycle looked like this: acquire the woman at a slave market, transport her to the city, put her to work, collect payment from clients, pay the state tax, keep the profit, reinvest in more women or better facilities. It was efficient, self-sustaining, legal, regulated, taxed. The modern parallel is uncomfortable. Supply chains, contractors instead of owners, legal frameworks that protect the business while maintaining distance from the workers, revenue models built on volume and pricing tiers. The language changes. The structure stays the same, but you're not paying for the system. You're standing in that upstairs hallway with 16 asses in your hand. You're paying for a woman. Let me introduce you to one. Her name appears in the graffiti just once. Uchikos Greia, Eutychus, the Greek. That's all we know for certain. A name, an ethnicity, scratched into plaster by a client who thought it mattered enough to record. We can reconstruct the rest from what we know about the slave trade in the 1st century CE. She probably came from the eastern provinces, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria. Maybe she was captured during a military campaign. Maybe her family sold her to pay debts. Maybe she was kidnapped by slave traders. She was transported west, sold at a slave market, bought by whoever owned the loop, put to work on the upper floor because she was young, foreign, exotic, worth 16 asses instead of 2. Her room is on the 2nd floor, maybe 8 feet by 10, but compared to the ground floor cells, it's luxury. There's a wooden bed frame, a wool mattress, a small table with watered wine and 2 clay cups, a bronze mirror, an oil lamp. When you enter, she's already smiling, professional, practiced, warm enough to make you feel chosen. She pours you wine without asking. Her movements are smooth. This is part of the service. She asks where you're from. What brings you to Pompeii? She makes the conversation feel natural, like you're two people who just happened to meet, not a transaction. Her hand rests on your thigh, light pressure, patient. You're paying for the fantasy that she wants this, that she chose you, that when she leans close and whispers, it's because she finds you attractive, not because you have 16 asses. This is her 8th client of the day, maybe her 9th. Her body moves through the motions automatically. Her mind is somewhere else. The women downstairs have it worse. Archaeologists examining skeletal remains from Herculaneum found bone stress markers in the knees, damage to the lower back, the kind of repetitive injury from holding positions for hours, every day, for years. Some women serviced dozens of men during festival periods. The inscriptions mark the dates, days when men lined up and carved their names just to prove they got their turn. The stone beds downstairs were waist-high, the cells too small to lie down comfortably, positions forced by the architecture. Speed over comfort, volume over experience. Eutychus had it better. She had time, a bed, the illusion of dignity. But it was still work, transaction after transaction. By the time you leave, she's preparing for the next one, pouring wine, straightening the bed, smiling that same smile. You pass a stylus on the windowsill. The walls are covered in inscriptions. Men who came before you, leaving their marks. Maybe you write something too. A review, beneficiate, she fucks well. Or maybe you write what one man wrote. One inscription that survived 2,000 years. But there was one man who came to the Lupena and couldn't go through with it. And what he wrote on the wall changed everything. One inscription stands out from all the others. Vibius restitutus, dormit hic cum urbana. Vibius restitutus slept here alone, and missed his darling Urbana. Not here I fucked. Not a review. Not a boast. A confession. Vibius restitutus was likely a soldier. The name suggests military service. Roman soldiers were stationed far from home for years at a time. They couldn't marry while on active duty, but many had lovers, wives in all but name. Urbana was probably his. Someone real, someone he loved. He came to the Lupena, paid for a room. Maybe he had 16 asses. Maybe he intended to go through with it, but he couldn't, so he just slept, alone, in a brothel, surrounded by the sounds of transactions happening in other rooms. In the morning, overcome by loneliness or guilt or simple honesty, he scratched the truth into the plaster. He missed Urbana. Think about what that means. Every other inscription in that building is about assertion, proof, conquest. I was here. I did this. I am a man. This one is about absence, about longing, about love. It's tender, vulnerable, real. In a building designed to erase intimacy, one man demanded to be seen as something other than a transaction. He wanted the walls to remember that he loved someone, that he was faithful, that he was more than just another customer. His words were never meant to last. Graffiti fades. Plaster crumbles. Rain washes it away. In a few months, maybe a year, his confession would have been covered by new inscriptions. Forgotten. But a few weeks later, maybe a few months, Mount Vesuvius erupted. On August 24th, in the year 79 CE, the volcano buried Pompeii under 20 feet of volcanic ash. The city was frozen, preserved, sealed in time. The ash that killed thousands of people also saved Vibius restitutus's words. When archaeologists excavated the Lupena in 1862, they found his inscription still there, still readable. Nearly 2,000 years later, the soldier who couldn't go through with it, who slept alone and missed his darling Urbana. His words outlasted the Roman Empire, outlasted the building, outlasted everything except the volcanic rock that preserved them, and they tell us something important. Humanity survives, even in systems designed to strip it away, even in transactions meant to be emotionless, even in buildings built for nothing but commerce. One man refused, and left proof. His words outlasted empires. But they weren't the only thing the volcano preserved. August 24th, 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted. The column of ash rose miles into the sky. Pumice rained down on Pompeii. The city was buried, 20 feet of volcanic material. In less than 2 days, everything stopped. Thousands died. The city disappeared. But the ash preserved what it destroyed. The graffiti on the walls of the Lupena, the frescoes above the doorways, the stone beds, the wine cups still sitting on tables, the oil lamps, the wooden staircase, the plaster with its hundreds of scratched inscriptions, all frozen in time. The catastrophe that killed the city saved the evidence. In 1862, archaeologists began excavating the Lupena. What they found shocked them. These scholars had studied Latin literature, Ovid, Virgil, the polished poetry of the Roman elite, clean language, metaphors, euphemisms. This was something else entirely. Raw, street, Latin, crude, direct, unfiltered. Over 120 inscriptions were catalogued, each one a voice from the past, each one proof of what actually happened in this building. What we lost was the living moment, the actual people, their voices, their stories beyond what they scratched into walls. What we gained was truth, unfiltered evidence of how normal people lived, what they did, what they paid for, how they thought about sex, about power, about intimacy. The inscriptions are time capsules, honest in a way that official records never are. So what do these preserved words actually tell us? What does it mean when a civilization treats sex like bread? What does it mean when civilization makes sex as cheap as bread? The answer arrives in layers, each more disturbing than the last. First, systematic commodification. Rome didn't stumble into prostitution, it engineered it. Bodies were sourced like grain, processed through slave markets, distributed via brothels that lined every major street. The machinery worked with industrial efficiency, supply chains, quality control, market segmentation. Second, legal frameworks that protected the system while maintaining moral distance. Prostitutes couldn't testify in court, couldn't inherit property, couldn't marry citizens. The law created a separate class of humans commercially accessible, legally invisible, available for use but excluded from society. Third, pricing tiers. The Lupena served the poor. Private brothels catered to the middle class. High-end courtesans entertained the wealthy. Every social stratum had its corresponding sexual marketplace. No one was excluded from participation. Fourth, social order maintenance. The system wasn't accidental, it was structural. Brothels protected respectable women by absorbing male desire into commercial channels. Cato the Elder praised a young man emerging from a lupanar. Better to come here than to grind away at other men's wives. The logic was explicit. Prostitution preserved marriage, hierarchy, respectability. The Roman mind understood what we'd pretend not to. Hierarchy requires people at the bottom. Someone must be consumable for others to remain protected. Someone must be cheap for others to remain valuable. The state became the ultimate pimp, not through violence but through bureaucracy, taxes, regulations, licenses. The empire collected revenue from every transaction, making it complicit in every exploitation. Government, as business partner to commercial rape, and they wrote it down. Every price, every regulation, every tax receipt, not from shame, not from pride, just normalcy. This was how civilization worked. Buying a person was as casual as buying bread, as unremarkable as a business transaction, as ordinary as any other economic exchange in a functioning society. The machinery hummed along for centuries, efficient and terrible and perfectly legal. But before you feel superior to the Romans, consider what your own civilization has made cheap, what systems it has normalized, what exploitation it has bureaucratized into invisibility. The machinery never stops, it just changes forms. You've already bought dinner for someone you barely knew, hoping the evening would end a certain way, calculated the investment, managed the expectations, negotiated the unspoken terms. Dating apps function as modern menus. Swipe through profiles, filter by preference, match, transact. The language has changed. We say connection instead of transaction, but the mechanics remain familiar. Sugar daddy arrangements, OnlyFans subscriptions, escort companionship services that carefully avoid certain words. We've built elaborate systems of plausible deniability around exchanges the Romans simply priced and taxed. The machinery changes. The legal frameworks evolve. The language shifts to protect us from what we're doing. But the transaction remains remarkably familiar. We still commodify bodies, we just pretend we don't. The Romans wrote the price on the brothel wall. We've built elaborate systems of plausible deniability around exchanges the Romans simply priced and taxed. The machinery changes. The legal frameworks evolve. The language shifts to protect us from what we're doing. But the transaction remains remarkably familiar. We still commodify bodies, we just pretend we don't. The Romans wrote the price on the brothel wall. What will they conclude about how we valued human beings, about what we made cheap and what we protected? What are we writing right now that we think no one will ever read? The Lupena survived because someone buried it in volcanic ash. Our data survives because we store everything, encrypt nothing permanently. Believe deletion means erasure. Future scholars won't need to excavate. They'll just need to hic futui, here I fucked. 3 Latin words that survived 2,000 years to tell us something uncomfortable about the past and something even more uncomfortable about ourselves. The Romans at least had the honesty to write the price on the wall. We just swipe right and hope nobody's keeping records.